The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how to move beyond political hobbyism and make real change. Plus, what is nonviolent resistance and why does it work? And Bill Press with journalist Molly Ball on her new biography of Nancy Pelosi. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Author Eitan Hersh says millions of Americans see politics as a form of self-expression rather than as a mechanism for change. In his new book, he explains why this is bad for democracy and shows us a way toward more effective political participation. And we say hello to Eitan Hersh, professor of political science and civic studies at Tufts University. His research focuses on civic participation and American politics. His newest book, Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. Eitan Hersh, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. This book explores a paradox. In many ways, people are spending more time on politics, but it doesn't turn into action. You call what most people do political hobbyism. Why did you choose the word hobbyism?
I chose the word hobbyism because it's really the way people are doing politics is as an activity really to satisfy their own intellectual and emotional needs. It's for them, not to for other people, not as a service to the community, not to empower values, but really as sort of like a shallow form of personal gratification. And you know that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. There's something about the hobbyism accusation that feels like an accusation. And I want people to sit a little bit uncomfortably with this question of, you know, if they added up all the time they spend thinking about politics, talking about politics, engaging in politics in some way, does it for them amount to a hobby or something more than that?
Mm-hmm. On the other side of the spectrum, what does political action look like?
Yeah, so when I think about political engagement, I think about people working together with some goals and strategies to influence the government, right? That to me is a definition of political participation. You have to, you know, if you're trying to influence the government, you might be talking to voters to try to get them how to vote a certain way. You might be talking to politicians to how they, you know, act in the legislature a certain way. Either way, you're working with other people to move something. And in that sense, you're doing something that is power seeking. You know, not only does hobbyism not sit well with people, the idea of political power doesn't sit well with people. What that means is getting other people in your community, in your life, to take some action they wouldn't take without you doing it. That's what power is all about. And that's what politics is all about. It's about moving people forward in some direction that you care about with some goals and strategies. And that just doesn't right now describe how most people are doing in politics. Most people who are cognitively engaged in politics are more in the realm of like learning facts and debating as opposed to getting power for the things they care about.
Now, does one come at the expense of the other? In other words, shouldn't that intense political interest at some time translate into action?
Yeah, well, the problem is I evaluate that question quite in detail in the book. And the main problem is that in political hobbyism, we tend to be learning the wrong facts and practicing the wrong skills. So most people who are political junkies, for example, who spend a lot of time following the news, they follow kind of national drama and horse race news. And if you ask the standard political junkie, if you go to your friend who's a political junkie and say, how can I get involved in some issue I care about? Maybe it's climate change, maybe it's this or that. How do I get involved? The junkie usually blushes and says, oh, I actually don't follow any of the news that would help you figure out how to get engaged, but I can tell you a lot about the Mueller report. And so that's the sense in which the hobbyists tend to be learning the wrong information. They're also practicing the wrong skills. In the book that I've written, I tell the stories of 7 organizers, volunteers who are engaged in politics. And if you look at the kind of skill set that they practice, it is empathy, it is respect, it is the same skill set we would practice anytime we need to get other people to do something. I think about if you want to get your employer, or maybe if you are an employer, your employee to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. Or maybe you're in a power relationship with someone in your family, your children, your parents. You want them to take some action they wouldn't otherwise take. That requires, eye contact and respect and trying to understand, where is this person coming from? What do they care about? And in political hobbyism, the kind that most of us spend our time on, we actually are not doing that at all. We're not trying to get anyone to take an action they wouldn't otherwise take. We're trying to do something for ourselves, to feel kind of an emotional catharsis, to get something off our chest. And that's why political discourse online often doesn't have the flavor of empathy and mutual respect, but of anger and impatience. And because, we're not really trying to get anyone to do anything.
Right. And man, oh man, that is just, that's everywhere too. There aren't just discussions on Facebook or any of the other social media. It's just flat out rah, 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 back and forth, and nothing comes of it. And I think much of this hobbyism has to do with the media. Do you think, is there more than the pull of our political media environment to explain why this hobbyism has taken root?
Yeah, I tend not to blame the media, because what's happened over time as the media has diversified, has there been more opportunities for different media channels to emerge, is that we have revealed ourselves what we want out of politics, right? We have revealed that we actually love the juicy national gossip. We love the provocation and outrage. You take something that's not really about the media, but something like campaign contributions. I often talk to audiences and say, who is the best politician at getting low-dollar donations? And almost every time I ask this question, people think it's Bernie Sanders. He's the best at getting low-dollar donations. But of course, that's not true. It's Donald Trump. Donald Trump raised more money in 2016 among low-dollar donors than Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton combined. And it's not a secret. It's that we know, every politician knows, the way to get low-dollar donations is to be very provocative and outrageous and make these viral videos. And so that's not really the media. That's us sitting on our couches responding to any stimuli that gives us that kind of instant gratification, that catharsis. And so we, in that setting, which is different from the media, are incentivizing politicians to act that way. And that's exactly what's happening on the media too. It's the same thing. It's like we follow the news that has that kind of outrage flavor, and it's national focus. It's not focused on ways that we can engage ourselves in our own communities. And it's focused on, I think, some of our worst instincts. So you could blame the media in the sense that, when there were 3 channels of TV news, news wasn't like this way. But the way that the news media has emerged in the current world is really just a response to what we, the viewers, are asking for.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Eitan Hersh, professor of political science and civic studies at Tufts University, and talking a little bit about his newest book, Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. Eitan, much of the press for the book identifies the hobbyist as most likely a white, educated liberal. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. Actually, and men. So if you did a survey and asked a bunch of factual questions, who knows the most facts about politics, or if you ask who spends the most time in politics, it's college-educated white men. Yeah, but if you look at like who is engaging in community organizations, who's actually doing volunteering, who is doing this kind of power building activity I'm talking about, which is working in groups with strategies and goals to influence the government. For one thing, it's about 2/3 women, even though men are spending much more time on politics than women, but it's just that they're mostly spending it on news consumption. And you would see it's disproportionately minorities, particularly African Americans. African Americans spend less time overall engaging in political news consumption, but more time engaged in organized political activity. And that's been true for the last 12 years or so. So yes, political, and in terms of the political bent of it, it's common among everyone. I mean, it's young people and old people, Democrats versus Republicans. Most people, like 80-90% of people who are engaged in politics, are not doing anything in terms of community organizing, in terms of building power. It's almost all, for everybody, it's almost all hobbyism, but it's particularly strong among college-educated white voters, and those people right now are overwhelmingly Democrats. I think also in this time from, since the Trump election, what you see is definitely a lot more Democrats than Republicans kind of emotionally activated, concerned about the direction of the country. But for almost all of them, that just doesn't translate into organizing or activity. It just translates into news following and kind of debating.
Mm-hmm. What do you believe are the biggest obstacles to being politically active?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing is this paradigm shift that folks have to make in their heads, that their job as a citizen is not to pay attention to important things going on in Washington, but their job as a citizen is to be important, to be important to a community. The people who I profile in the book. I mean, there's an example of this man in Boston. He didn't start any political activity until he was in retirement, but pretty soon after, they started calling him the Ukrainian boss. Controls 1,000 votes in his old age home. Can get on the phone with any politician anytime, because no one outside of the community knows who he is, right? He's not paying attention to what's going on in Washington, but he is an important citizen because he has built trust with his neighbors and convinced them how to vote and that they should vote. That is what citizenship is about. So I think the biggest paradigm shift people have to make is like, stop paying attention to all the national stuff, pay attention to local stuff. If you're the kind of person, my book is definitely not designed to like call out someone who doesn't care about politics and doesn't have time for politics, someone who's working 2 jobs and just does no headspace for this. My book is geared toward the person who is already spending an hour or 2 every day thinking about politics, but they don't take their role seriously. And through these profiles of ordinary people who, they're mostly not people who are, ideologues, are not mostly people who are protesters, although there's some of that. It's mostly people who really are invested in their community and see politics as a way of serving their community's needs. So for me, the biggest obstacle is people, kind of realizing their own role. And then, I think there's other obstacles too. I mean, in the book, I talk about how there's been this big decline over time in local infrastructure. For example, Democratic Party committees, which used to be strong across the country, are mostly not strong now. They're very weak. I mean, if you kind of woke up after the 2016 election and said, "Oh my God, I don't like what happened here because I'm a Democrat and I don't like that Trump won," and you start Googling around, like, is there a Democratic Party in my county or in my town? You'd mostly find a bunch of people who do nothing other than like wait for a state party convention to attend. You'd find a Democratic infrastructure that has no money at the local level, and essentially has no ambition other than to, attend a state convention. And so I think one of the reasons you see on the left all of these kind of pop-up organizations emerge after the 2016 election is is because there was not a lot of party infrastructure on the left. By the way, this is true on the right too. I mean, the reason you see the Tea Party emerge is because the party organizations have long been stagnant and don't have a role. And there's an interesting historical story in the book about why that is, why the political parties have kind of disempowered on purpose. They've taken power away from local party committees. The most recent policy change on this is the campaign finance reform that Democrats really love. Part of it was overturned by Citizens United, but one of the big things that wasn't overturned by Citizens United was stopping national parties like the Democratic National Committee from transferring money to state and local party committees for party building activities. That was called soft money. This idea that the DNC can raise a lot of money, can give some of that money to local parties to do things like voter registration drives. Democrats killed that process by banning soft money, which has now bled local political parties of their money. I talk about in the book my own local Democratic Party committee. I live in a very Democratic town outside of Boston, in Brookline. And, in 2016, the biggest expenditure by the Brookline Democrats. This is a town that's 90% Democratic. It's an hour from this New Hampshire border. You might think that they were spending a lot of money. They have no office, they have no staff, they have no full-time organizers. In fact, in 2016, their biggest expenditure was $1,300 to the local Chinese buffet restaurant where they hosted like one of their social gatherings. And that, not to knock my own community, which is plenty politically active, but that is representative of political parties throughout the country that don't do very much. Sorry, this is a long answer to your question, but
no, but it's a really good answer, and it's certainly worth everybody hearing. So I certainly appreciate it. So what do you think it would take to convince someone to give up the hobby and get off the couch?
I mean, to me, I as a political science professor, whenever I think I'm often the recipient of people's questions about, how do you think the horse race is going? What do you think of Nate Silver's latest polls? What do you think about what happened in the congressional hearing? I have friends who are not professional political scientists who will spend hours watching a congressional hearing. And I would say, that stuff is not interesting because to me, this stuff has never really been interesting to me. But it's mostly not interesting because, again, I have no role to play in that. A regular person has no role to play in the Neil Gorsuch Senate hearings, but in their own community, they do have a role to play, and it's fascinating. This is not in the book, but I recently, or this past summer, I took students to a zoning board meeting. And, you go to a zoning board meeting, and these students have never been to a zoning board meeting before, and the people you encounter at the zoning board and who they are and what they want and what they care about, and that's interesting politics. That to me is much more interesting. So I would say that we need a sea change here where people aren't at dinner parties, or in this case at Zoom hangouts, asking each other what they think about, who Joe Biden should choose as his vice president, but they should ask each other, how many votes are you getting? How many votes are you personally getting? How many people are you helping to get an absentee ballot for? What's your goal? How are you doing it? To me, that's just such a more interesting conversation. So I think my biggest hope is that people make that change.
So as a follow-up to that, when you mentioned the zoning board hearing, right? And people are going to think, well, gosh, that's a snoozer. But there you are in your community taking part in something that has a direct effect on you. Is that a good place for folks to start to get off the couch? Start with your local politics? Because quite frankly, I've always believed the local politics is a heck of a lot more important than the national politics.
That's right. I mean, and I think it's interesting you called it a snoozer. I think a lot of people do think of it that way. I mean, a lot of people. Here's another hypothetical. If I ask people, would you invest either money or time into a 25-year-old kid right out of law school who wants to run for county judge? And a lot of people think, ugh, that's parochial. I would never want to do that. That sounds boring. It's like a sleeper. And some people would say, hell yeah, I want to do that, because in 30 years, that person might be eligible to be on the Supreme Court.
Right.
If you're the kind of person that thinks that, only the big important stuff's happening in Washington, you're not doing politics right. Because, even if you ask Democrats today, like, what are the big issues they care about? They Number one issue at this point, I think, is probably climate change, they'll say. And they might also say something like, racial equality or racial harmony. And those issues have a lot of work to do at the local level, a real lot of work. The zoning board, which is looking at density and housing and transit, all of those have real implications for the environment and for racial equality. What kind of school systems folks have from different racial communities? Okay, and so the thing is that I think a lot of Democrats don't want to work on those issues, because that is going to they're going to realize that actually they might not be as strongly progressive as they like to think they are on those issues, and they also don't want to necessarily fight with their neighbors about it, because they might live in a town that that might all vote the same way, Democratic at a national level. But as soon as you start talking about inclusionary zoning and all sorts of stuff like that, then very quickly people start thinking about the bottom line. I like this example in Massachusetts of, this huge percentage of Bernie Sanders voters voted for our Republican governor, Charlie Baker. He's very popular, doesn't want to raise the gas tax by a cent to deal with, some of our transit issues related to the environment. Like, people need to, I think at the local level, that's where the interesting stuff happens, because I think people have to really grapple more with what these issues mean on the ground.
All right. Now, you tell 7 stories of organizers in the book. Why was it so important to include these stories? And would love it if you could share one with us.
Sure. So, it's funny, I started writing the book, or a draft of the book, and it was mostly focused on this problem of hobbyism, all the stats about how we engage in news consumption and partisan cheerleading and slacktivism online. And I had an undergrad student who was like my research assistant, and she read the first draft and she said, this is such a bummer. No one's going to want to read this. It's so depressing. And at that point, I decided that I really did need to focus the book not just on what the problem is, but what the solution is. And I started spending time with these organizers who range in age from 19 to 98, who are really, and they really affected me in a way in a deep way that I wasn't expecting. And they affected me because I never have seen myself as the kind of person who would be particularly active in real politics for a whole number of reasons. And in part, I think the image I had of a political organizer or activist was someone very different from me. Maybe someone who has stronger ideological positions, someone maybe who likes to be at rallies or have bumper stickers, and none of that really spoke to me. But when I started spending time with these organizers, I learned that the people who I think are most effective in politics are not like that cliche image I have of an activist. They're people who are deeply invested in their community, that they see politics as a form of service they do for others in their community. One example of this is a woman named Kiris Matias. She is in her 50s. She's a school bus monitor for a special needs school. And she started this group that she calls the Latino Coalition in her town, which brings together Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and other members of the Latino community. And they do a real wide range of stuff. I mean, they get out the vote in elections, but they also talk to the local school superintendent about why there aren't people at the schools who can talk to the parents in Spanish. They talk to the police department about how the police department's interacting with ICE. They talk to the mayor about why Latinos, even though they're 20% of the town, are underrepresented in jobs and boards and things like that. And so they do politics that's national for sure. I mean, they talk to a member of Congress about housing and about immigration and all that. And they talk to local people, and they're doing politics as a form of service. That is, they're empowering their community by helping them with their concrete needs, like we need to be able to speak to the teachers in our schools, and they're working on issues of national significance too. And Kiris is not on Twitter or Facebook or she does not engage in the hobbyism at all, and it's just like not what politics is about for her. And so I love spending time with these people and kind of learning how they see their role, and they all see their roles in different ways, essentially counting people, like that they're entitled to one vote as a citizen, and how many more can they get? Can they get 100? Can they get 500? And what's so shocking in a way is that if you get 500 people, if you get 100 people to vote the way you want them to vote, or to attend a meeting, you have an unusually high amount of power in our political system. It sounds small, but it's not, because so few people have that. There's the elderly man in the book who I mentioned briefly, who kind of called the Ukrainian boss. All he did, he so-called controlled 1,000 votes, and you can see this. His precinct had 2 or 3 times the voting rates of all the precincts around it. And the story of how he got his community engaged in politics, these are a community of low-income refugees, is like fascinating. But I have to say that after the book was written, but before it came out, this man died 3 days short of his 99th birthday, and I went to his funeral. And when a 99-year-old dies, usually there's not like a huge number of people there. Yeah, and there were maybe 50 people from his community, but then sitting in the front row of this funeral home was the mayor of Boston and the governor of Massachusetts and city councilors and state legislators. And they certainly weren't there to get votes or take pictures. There was no votes to get there, but they were there to pay tribute to this guy who never organized anyone outside of his own community, but in his community, he was a hero. Wow. And I think that's the kind of politics that people, that it's both impressive, but incredibly accessible. Like many of us could do that. And he didn't start until he was in his 70s.
Wow. That's inspiration. I mean, it really is. Hey, before we let you go, when people refrain from political activity, who are the winners and the losers?
Well, I think power in our political system always goes to those who are organized. When we do politics as a hobby and we're not really trying to get anything, we don't have any goals, those who are organized and have goals gain power instead. In the beginning of the book, I tell this brief story from the 2018 election about the Ku Klux Klan. And in 2018, in North Carolina, the Ku Klux Klan went around with flyers, and they said, do you have an opioid addiction? It's not your fault. We here at the White Knights of the KKK are here to help you. And I tell that story because I want the hobbyists to see who is doing strategic power-seeking activity as they sit at home. Like, if the Ku Klux Klan is not going around just saying, hey, we have this white nationalist hateful agenda, come join us. They're looking people in the eye and saying, we're here to help you. And I want that to be an oh shit moment for a lot of people and say, okay, you're making a choice. If you're the kind of person that has an hour or two to spend on politics and you're spending it like share on Facebook, like you are ceding power to people who want it more than you. And if that's okay with you, then okay, that's your choice. But for a lot of people, I want that to be a very uncomfortable choice.
Yeah, as well it should be, and hopefully it will become more so. Eitan Hersh, professor of political science and civic studies at Tufts University. His latest book, Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. Eitan, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Would love to have you back again soon to talk some more about it.
Cool, thanks so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, from American suffragists to civil rights to the climate change movement, how nonviolent activism changes the world. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Amazingly, America has become a nation of socialists, asking in dismay, where's the government? These are not born-again Bernie Sanders activists, but everyday people of all political stripes, including previously apolitical multitudes who are now clamoring for big government intervention in their lives. Nothing like a spreading coronavirus pandemic to bring home the need that all of us have, both as individuals and as a society, for an adequately funded, fully functioning, competent government capable of serving all. Instead, in our moment of critical national need, Trump's government has been a rickety medicine show run by a small-minded flimflammer peddling laissez-fairyland snake oil. We have it totally under control, Trump pompously declared after the first U.S. case was confirmed in January. For weeks, as the pandemic spread out of control, he did nothing. An increasingly anxious public found that they couldn't even get reliable test kits from Trump's hollowed-out government health agencies. Still, he shrugged off all concern and responsibility. By April, in theory, he said, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. Not exactly a can-do Rooseveltian response to a national crisis. That complete absence of White House leadership is why a deadly pathogen is now raging practically everywhere across our land. Unknown millions of us are being infected. A closed indefinitely sign has literally been hung on the American economy, and even our people's social and civic interactions, the essence of community life, have been halted. This is Jim Hightower saying, right-wing politico Grover Norquist once said he wanted a government so small I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. Trump has shown us what such a small-minded government looks like and what it costs us.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his new book for young readers, Todd Hasak-Lowy tells the stories of powerful leaders who used nonviolent resistance to bring lasting change. He says what they understood about politics and power is a necessary lesson for today's world. And we say hello to Todd Hasak-Lowy, professor of creative writing and literature at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago and the author of We Are Power: How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. Todd Hasak-Lowy, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You've written a book about nonviolent activism aimed at 10 to 14-year-olds. What made you decide to write this book?
I wanted to write a book that would do two different things. One was I wanted to give the reader something that would be uplifting, that would give them some hope. I think even young people right now have their eyes open and realize we're in a tough time. So I wanted to give them a book that would not make them feel down. But secondly, and this is, I think, even more important, I wanted to write a book that felt a little bit like a guide, a book that offered some stories and some lessons that would provide perhaps a way out of the situation that we're currently in. And so I wanted to put those two together. That's one of the reasons that the book, you just said the title it's officially a history book, and yet the subtitle of the book, and in fact, the not subtitle of the book, are both using present tense verbs. We are power, how nonviolent activism changes history. So I wanted to give readers a book that would sort of answer the question, what in the world should I be doing right now?
It sounds like a fairly straightforward idea, nonviolent activism, but it actually defines a way of being in the world. How do you define nonviolent activism?
Well, I think of nonviolent activism as a subcategory of activism more broadly. And the subcategory I'm talking about is confrontational action that disrupts the status quo, but does so without using tools of violence. So to give an example, from the news right now, we're seeing cases, for instance, at some Amazon warehouses in which workers, essential workers, are refusing to work because they think that they're either not being adequately compensated or their safety is not being taken into account. And so they are disrupting the status quo by walking out of work, right? And so in terms of the larger question of sort of a way of being in the world, I think the key thing, and I think the key misunderstanding about nonviolent activism, is that nonviolent activists are people that seek out conflict when they identify injustice. I think often when you hear nonviolence, you think, oh, it's passive, or it's weak, or it's soft. And in fact, I think the thing that most kind of amazed me as I studied these people and these stories was that these were people that were courageous in a very unusual way, in that they were willing to enter into conflict with opponents who were on the surface much stronger than them, that certainly had access to sort of more traditional tools of power and violence, because they knew that was the only way to undo an injustice that was really widespread and making their lives intolerable.
A nonviolent activist is not necessarily a quiet voice.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
No, I mean, Gandhi famously said, right, I regard myself as a soldier, but a soldier of peace, right? And so there's often this kind of paradoxical, almost oxymoronic flavor to it until you get into the details and you see how it works.
Now, as told through the stories in your book, it is a strategy that has had remarkable success. What makes nonviolent activism so effective?
I think the first thing is that nonviolent activists understand something about power that I think a lot of the rest of us don't understand. And they understand that, for instance, the notion that numbers are power resides in numbers is actually true. I think a lot of us, certainly right now, you read the paper each day and you kind of have this feeling that history is sort of happening to you. And your ability to change it is a thing that's restricted to, you vote once a year or every 2 years or every 4 years. And other than that, you give these people power and they go and run your lives. And one thing that I think nonviolent activists understand is that's not how power works. That power is actually a relationship in which people often give sort of consent to others to rule their lives, and that can be taken away. And so what nonviolent activists do, and it involves enormous organization and mobilization and often quite a bit of patience, is they take that power away from the people who we think have it, right? By, again, disrupting the status quo. So you, the boss, you think you're in charge, but if we all refuse to work, you're not in charge anymore. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, and this is more of a sort of tactical, strategic thing, is that nonviolent direct action. So when you actually have a campaign underway, what it often leads to is sacrifice and suffering that is often sort of almost theatrical in nature. So most famously, we can think of during the civil rights movement in Birmingham in 1963, when you have these young activists, some of them were children, being sprayed with fire hoses and actually slammed up against walls and bitten by dogs. And the images of that were very, very effective in terms of mobilizing more people that could become activists, getting bystanders on the side to join them, to support their cause, and then getting support from the opponent they would have dissent. They would stop supporting them. And so that's why it works.
You know, I mentioned the first question to you is that this book is aimed at 10 to 14-year-olds. And I imagine early adolescence, well, it is a critical time for a lot of things for young folks, but in terms of how they will later engage with the world. And what do we know about this age that would make this a good time to introduce the idea of nonviolent activism?
I think there's a number of things. I think, first of all, young people, and this starts even before the age of 10, the first sort of abstract way they start to understand power dynamics and things like that is this notion of fair. So you can take a 5-year-old and they can tell you right away if they're in a situation that's unfair. And that's obviously something that stays with people throughout their lives. But I think part of being an adult is learning, unfortunately, to encounter things that are unfair all the time and just sort of say, well, that's the way the world is. And I think young people, thankfully, don't have a ton of practice with that yet. And they still are less likely to just say, well, that's how it is. What are we going to do? So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is they're beginning to understand the world on a kind of a large scale. They're beginning to understand this thing that adults call politics. And then they're also beginning to see that things could be otherwise, that things could be different. And I think when you combine those things together and then show them examples of people who made a difference and even young people that made a difference, I think they can be really energized to do something about this. And I think they really, I think especially now, I think young people are really looking around and seeing how broken things are right now. And I think they realize on some level that they have it in them to do something about it. I think that's one of the many reasons that Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, has become the figure that she's become, because it speaks to young people as well as adults.
It's exciting to me, and since you brought her up, to think of the effect that she's going to have on so many kids her age and younger, maybe even a little older. It's actually exciting, and it'll be fun to see what happens in another 5 and 10 years with some of these kids coming up at this time.
I just want to add one thing, that it is sort of, to a certain extent, this is a young person's game or tactic or strategy. So, Martin Luther King Jr. at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott was 25 years old. Which, again, not a kid, but that's a young, for people in middle age. You think of what 25-year-olds doing, you don't think something like that.
Right.
And then obviously the Birmingham campaign as well was really, the tide turned when young people got involved. And I think another reason that young people are so good is that they're, as parents know, they have a different calculus regarding risk than adults do. And
right.
and they're ready to take risks, and they have a different sense of danger, right? For better or for worse. It makes us nervous when they head off on their bikes or whatever, but effective nonviolent campaigns often require taking risks and putting yourself in danger, and young people are really good at that.
We're speaking with Todd Hasak-Lowy, professor of creative writing and literature at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago, also the author of We Are Power, How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. Todd, the book focuses on one leader per chapter, and there are chapters devoted to people such as Gandhi, whom you mentioned, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, inspiring people, without a doubt. But today's youth live in a very in-the-moment culture. Do you find they respond to these historical figures the same way perhaps we do?
I think they do. I think, first of all, young people have to take history classes like any other student. And so they are aware of history. I think that, and I think they have heroes like everyone else. And I actually think that they're looking for alternative types of heroes, heroes that are people that are fighting against injustice and things like that. But I think the other thing is that, you know, you talk about social media and living in the moment. I think one of the things that I'm seeing when I go on social media is that there's a lot of young people who are using social media to help create an identity that's allowing them to be these people, right? So you have this enormous kind of wave of youth activism happening, and that is how a number of young people are deciding to sort of present their public identity to the world. You know, you look at like people like Jamie Margolin, who runs an organization called 0 Hour. Obviously, Greta Thunberg is another example, but there are dozens and dozens of very prominent young people who are looking at history, but in a way that is very future oriented about what do I want the future to be like? Who can I be to help create the future that I want? So I think what I'm hoping this book does is that, you know, I think people often think of nonviolent activism as this sort of spontaneous thing that it just happens. And one of the great things that's happened in the last few decades is that people have come to understand that this is a technology. This is a thing that a person can study and apply, and you don't have to make it up from scratch. We're always seeing new strategies and new tactics, but one of the reasons to study this history is to really say, okay, so what do I do when I'm confronting this present problem?
Right.
And you can find answers in those stories.
Mm-hmm. Now, for these kids, this book comes at a very challenging time, which might be the understatement of my day. There's the rise of Donald Trump and some very anti-democratic tendencies along with him. And there is the pandemic crisis, which can certainly put a damper on future dreams. How do we convince young people that being an activist makes sense against what seems like overwhelming odds?
Well, I think first we have to teach history a little bit differently. I think, you know, so much of the way history is taught in schools is this kind of model of wars and presidents and, you know, elected officials and dictators. And I think one thing we have to do is to teach them other kinds of history, and histories that show how mass movements and mass nonviolent movements have made a big difference, so that they first have a more accurate understanding of really who makes history and how they make history. But I think the other thing is that we have to help them understand, by teaching this history differently, that history doesn't need to be something that happens to them, but that history is something that they can make. And that as such, that they have a responsibility to do that. I think young people are seeing right now that a lot of our institutions are either failing us or in need of radical repair. And I think really what nonviolent activism is all about is creating a kind of productive, restorative dialogue between our institutions and action outside of them. So if you think about, you take any example, right, the women's suffrage movement, they sort of broke the rules to change the rules, right? They protested, they went to jail, but they didn't do this to tear down the government. They did it to change the Constitution. And so I think right now we need to let young people see that if you want this country or this world to sort of function better, this is a way to do it. And I think they are seeing enough that no one's coming along to save them, which is, you know, the unfortunate, sobering truth that they are, along with hopefully older generations, are going to have to realize this change themselves.
Mm-hmm. Hey, before we let you go, in another interview about the book, you said that writing the book actually changed you. In what ways?
So I'm a writer and a professor, and I don't want to speak for that class of people in its entirety, because there's all sorts of different writers and professors, but I know that part of my attraction to that was to sort of be left alone, to not be in confrontation with other people, to be able to sit and think my thoughts and write my words. And I think in a sort of a way that I was not aware of, I think that partially led me to think of conflict as a bad thing, and to think that people that welcome conflict are aggressive and selfish and want to control me in the world. And one of the things I understood as I wrote this book and read about these people was that conflict can be necessary, and that it's actually the responsibility of all of us, especially those of us who sort of think we're on the right side of things, on the correct side of things, to not leave it to the other people to decide what's going to happen. And that this involves welcoming conflict, getting out there and, as John Lewis says, good trouble, making things unpleasant for other people so that there will be change. So I'm trying, to put that myself into action and getting involved and doing things. But I think at the beginning, at least as a mindset, it's been really eye-opening for me.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of people could learn from. And I think that although this book is aimed at 10 to 14-year-olds, I think maybe many older folks could probably enjoy this book as well.
Well, and I think also one thing we know right now, I think adults are probably, to the extent they're reading it all right now, with all the distractions and the stresses, a book for 10 to 14-year-olds is probably right at their reading level right now. So, but I will say on a slightly more serious note as well, this is one of these topics. The book I wrote before this was a book just about the suffrage movement. And I think most adults, we sort of know what that is. Like you tell someone, oh, I'm writing on nonviolence, and they sort of nod their head. But the truth is, and I was no different at the start of this project, we don't really know much about it. Gandhi, MLK, and that's kind of it. And so I actually do think this is a book that, regardless of your age, if you want to know truly what this is all about, this is as good a place as any to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more than just the headlines that we all remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's great stuff. Todd Hasak-Lowy, professor of creative writing and literature at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago, and the author of what we've been talking about today, We Are Power, How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. Todd, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back and do it again soon.
Thank you. I'd love to come back. Be well.
Thanks, you as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. How Nancy Pelosi became the most powerful Democrat in the country. Bill Press with author Molly Ball.
So I want to start at the end because I was struck in the afterword to the book where you say that about Nancy Pelosi, you don't have to agree with her to respect her accomplishments and appreciate her historic career. So in spending almost 2 years writing this book, interviewing Nancy Pelosi several times, looking at her career, talking to a lot of her friends and associates, what did you discover to be her strengths and then her weaknesses?
Well, a few things about her career that I think can be appreciated by partisans of all stripes. And in fact, I do know some Republicans who do, if not admire her, respect her skills. One is just her incredible effectiveness as a legislator. If you talk to, scholars of Congress, they will tell you that probably not since LBJ or Sam Rayburn has there been a legislator who was simply as good at managing the process, getting big pieces of policy through the Congress, being effective in leading both their caucus and the House as a whole. And then the fact that she's the first woman speaker is not something that should be underestimated. It was hard for her to get there. She remains the only woman who's ever led a party in the Congress. 100 years after women got the right to vote, she is the only woman who has been at that table of congressional leadership. And that's a remarkable feat. And she had to really fight to get there. Keep in mind, when she got to Congress in 1987, she was one of 23 women in the 435-member House of Representatives. So She fought very hard to get where she is.
Right.
And she did it twice.
I'm sorry. Yes, right. And it did twice. Clearly the most powerful woman ever in American politics. Would you agree?
I think it's true just as a matter of her title. I mean, I suppose she's certainly the most powerful politician in elective office. You can quibble with, does a governor have more power at their disposal on a day-to-day basis? Does the Secretary of State perhaps have more latitude in terms of foreign policy? But in elected national political office, there isn't anyone, I think, more powerful than the Speaker of the House. She's second in the line of succession to the presidency. And you can see simply by the list of things that she's accomplished, that incredible power that she's had to shape the policies that affect all of our lives.
And she gets the title from several people, as you mentioned in the book, Master Legislator. Has there ever been a more effective Speaker of the House?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on congressional history, so I don't know how to, but I certainly have spoken to several people who were around for the past few speakers, who are around for the Gingrich speakership, the Tip O'Neill speakership, even some of the speakers of the past century. And she stacks up against them pretty impressively, especially when you consider the changes that have occurred in politics and in Congress during the time she's been there. She was in Congress for that, Newt Gingrich Republican Revolution in 1994, which is where a lot of scholars today and experts today trace a lot of the current dysfunction and partisanship and polarization to. So she's come to power in an era where it has been harder and harder for a lot of reasons for Congress to get anything done. And yet she's been able to get a lot of things done.
So I first met Nancy Pelosi when we were both active in Democratic politics in San Francisco. She is known, rightfully so, as a San Francisco Democrat. But as you point out, that's not where she started, right? It all began 3,000 miles away from San Francisco. Tell us about that.
That's right. She was born and raised in Baltimore, where her father was a member of Congress when she was born. And when she was 7 years old, he became the mayor of Baltimore. She actually swore him in for his first term as mayor, and it's one of her favorite early memories, and wrote the speech that he gave with help from the nuns at her Catholic school. So, she was very much shaped by that world of old school, white, ethnic, democratic, urban machine politics. That was the tradition that her father was a part of. And I think it's kind of a handy metaphor for not just her career, but the transformation of the Democratic Party that has gone from being the product of some of these sort of old school urban machines to the sort of coastal urban liberal party that she sort of represents today and is a part of today. And she is a very interesting combination of those two profiles, those two skill sets. On the one hand, she knows how to count votes. She knows how to organize and work the levers of power the way her father did back in the old days. On the other hand, she's very much representative of her district in a lot of the causes that she's advocated and the things that she's worked on throughout her career, and certainly in the way that she has been, some would say, caricatured by the right as this sort of avatar of the far left and as you said, the San Francisco Democrats.
Well, so I know a lot about her father, member of Congress and mayor, about her brother who was mayor. I didn't know until I read your book how important a force her mother, Annunziata, was in Nancy's political, let's say, education. And she, her mother, was really very much a part of the political machinery in Baltimore.
That's right. And I really did want to sort of recenter her mother in this narrative because when Nancy Pelosi talks about her, she talks about her as a partner in her father's political enterprise. But I think, for obvious reasons, not having had those titles in front of her name and the fact that Nancy Pelosi went into the family business, it's been natural for people to associate her with her father's tradition. But her mother was very important in her life. Her mother was sort of the brains of the political operation in a lot of ways, running the Baltimore Women's Democratic Club out of the basement of their row house in Little Italy, which was so crucial to getting out the vote in order to get her father elected. She also ran the so-called favor file, which was the sort of constituent services operation that was run out of the family parlor on the first floor, which meant, helping get people on welfare, helping get people into housing or into the hospital, and then knowing how to cash in those chits when the time came. And the other thing that I think is significant, there's her mother has been described as a very strong-willed, even aggressive person, someone who was never afraid to get up in anybody's face. There's a story that she once even punched a poll worker who displeased her. So she was no shrinking violet, and I think you can certainly see that in her daughter, her only daughter out of 6 surviving children. But the other thing about her mother that I think really influenced Nancy Pelosi's worldview is the way that she was stifled, the way that she was not allowed to achieve her goals and dreams because she was a woman at the time. Her mother wanted to be an auctioneer, wanted to go to law school, wanted to start her own business, even invented and patented a beauty device. But in those days, you needed a man's signature to do something like that. And her husband, Nancy Pelosi's father, would not allow her to. So I think in a lot of ways, Nancy Pelosi, at least earlier in her life, saw herself as sort of fulfilling the dreams that her mother was not allowed to, whether it was leaving home and going to college in a different city, or, eventually climbing the political ladder and having her own title in front of her name instead of just being a Mrs.
And you point out that young Nancy D'Alessandro wasn't just around the house. I mean, she herself, right, participated in the political machinery that was going on at the house. And she must have learned a lot of lessons there in Baltimore that still are that she's kind of applying in her role as Speaker of the House.
I think that's certainly true when you look at a lot of the skills that she brings to the process. At the same time, I don't want to overestimate it. And I think she and people around her sometimes feel like whenever a woman achieves power and prominence, there's an attempt to find the men who taught her how to do it in a way that there isn't always with a male political figure. We don't always go rooting around in their past to find, who was the man who gave him these skills. So I'm certainly not accusing you of anything, but yeah. I do think, when you think about leaving home at the age of 17 or 18, the things that you learn from your parents are really important, but they're not everything in life. And she did a lot herself to establish herself in politics and to learn things on her own.
Yeah, a couple of things. What I was really thinking about were, one, ability to count votes, which Nancy can count votes better than I think anybody else alive today, maybe. And also remembering people and giving people credit. And I'm sure that's something she learned from her mother too, right? And whenever I see Nancy in front of any group where there's any member of Congress, she goes out of her way to recognize each of those members of Congress and to say something good about each one of them.
That's right. And that's not necessarily something that a lot of politicians are good at, right? Politicians are really into their own power and their own ego. They're not always so good at sharing credit. But she has always realized that the key to her own power, particularly in the House, right, where you have to have the votes and the support of your caucus, is making your constituents basically feel represented. I think it also goes back to her effectiveness as a young mother. She had 5 children in 6 years after getting married right out of college. And she was, by all accounts, a tough but very effective leader of the family. And I think when you are trying to get children to do what you want them to do, whether it's clean their rooms or fold the laundry or just put their shoes on and go outside, you can't have your ego caught up in it, right? You've got to always be giving positive reinforcement in order to kind of get people all on the same page and marching in the same direction.
Right. And she certainly knows how to do that. So she moved, as you point out, she moves to San Francisco with her husband, Paul, banker, investor, venture capitalist. And Nancy gets involved in politics, but she didn't decide to run for office. It sort of came to her getting involved in politics. Tell us how that happened.
Well, she has always described herself as a sort of accidental politician, someone who never saw herself seeking political office herself. She saw herself as a strategist, someone who might operate behind the scenes, a fundraiser, a party operative, as you well know. But before she ever ended up running for office, she was well known as a fundraiser on the national circuit as well as the California circuit, and also was a top party player who was chair of the California Democratic Party, the largest Democratic Party in the country, made a failed bid for chair of the DNC, helped bring the 1984 Democratic Convention to San Francisco. She was already a player, but she always said she never wanted to be in elected office herself. And in fact, over the years that she was doing those things, many people asked her to run for office, and she always said no. It wasn't until in 1987, her good friend Sala Burton, the widow of the former Congressman Phil Burton, was dying of cancer and called her to her bedside and implored her to run for the seat in Congress after she passed away. And so, having made that dramatic deathbed promise to her close friend, Nancy Pelosi felt duty bound to follow through. And I think one thing that I have learned observing Nancy Pelosi is she doesn't do anything halfway. She wasn't going to just take a stab at it and maybe it would work out and maybe it wouldn't. She put her whole self into it, and it was a tough campaign, but it's the only tough campaign she's really had in her life. Ever since then, she's had a pretty firm grip on a safe seat in Congress.
And it was at that time, there are two or three adjectives about Nancy I wanted to ask you about, but Phil Burton, who was Sala's husband, a longtime congressman from San Francisco, said about Nancy, she was operational, which to him was the greatest compliment you could make of a politician. What's he mean by that? And how do you see Nancy as operational?
Yeah, I argue in the book that this is the single best word you can use to describe Nancy Pelosi. And it is a great compliment coming from Phil Burton, because what he meant was someone who cares about getting results more than anything else.
Gets things done.
Someone who gets things done, and someone who knows how to work the system to get things done. Someone whose first priority is not whether people like them or how they look in the press or anything like that, but are they achieving their political and policy goals? Are they improving people's lives through the policy process? And that was something that he saw in Nancy Pelosi.
Right. And for example, would there be an Affordable Care Act today without Nancy Pelosi?
I think it's quite likely that there would not. I think her skill at getting that legislation through the House was crucial to the effort. Not only that, but there was a moment when the Obama White House was tempted to back away, when it looked like the effort had failed, when they'd gotten one bill through the House and another bill through the Senate, and then the Democrats lost their 60th Senate vote with the defeat of the Democratic candidate in the Massachusetts Senate election. And you had a lot of Barack Obama's political advisors, such as then Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, saying, this is too heavy a lift, it can't be done, it's unpopular, the public is sick of it, let's just do something smaller and move on. And it was really Nancy Pelosi who said, look, this is something Democrats and Democratic presidents have been trying to achieve for the better part of a century. We have the potential here to do something truly historic. We can't stop now. And so she actually, she turned to President Obama in a meeting in the Oval Office, and she said, Mr. President, I know some people are urging you to take what she called the namby-pamby approach, but I don't think we should stop now. And he agreed with her, and I think that was a big reason. And she had to give a pep talk of similar proportions to her own caucus, because it had been so hard to get the legislation through the House in the first place, and then to have to go back to them and say, actually, we're going to have to pass a bill you like even less, was a really Herculean feat. And it speaks to, the credibility she built up with her colleagues, that they were willing to follow her down that path.
Bill Press talking with Molly Ball, national political correspondent for Time and author of Pelosi. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Eitan, Hersh, Todd Hasak-Lowy, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.